The letter fell from Frances Beckett's fingers before she had finished reading it. It landed in the dust at her feet, and the Arizona wind caught one corner and lifted it, and for a moment it seemed like the whole terrible truth might simply blow away into the pale morning sky. But Frances had already read the words. She had already seen her husband's handwriting, that familiar cramped scrawl she had spent 11 years learning to decipher, and she had already understood what Walter had done. What he had truly done, not just the dying part, which was bad enough, but everything that came before it, the debts, the signatures. The land she thought was hers, sold off piece by piece to a man she had never heard of, a man named Raymond Bailey, who owned half of Cochise County and was apparently now, according to the letter from Walter's attorney, the legal owner of the remaining acres she had believed were her inheritance, her future, her only way forward in this world. The horse behind her nickered softly. Copper, Walter's big sorrel gelding, the one thing of genuine value her husband had left behind without managing to sell or lose at a card table first. Copper pressed his broad nose against her shoulder, and she reached up and gripped his cheek piece and breath through her teeth and did not cry. She was done crying. She had spent 3 weeks crying in the cramped back room of her sister's house in Tucson, and now she had ridden 40 miles north through the heat of late May 1883 with her whole life packed into 2 saddlebags, and she was standing in front of a ranch gate with a painted wooden sign that read Bailey Land and Cattle Company, and she was not going to cry. She was going to walk through that gate and look Raymond Bailey in the eye and tell him exactly what she thought of men who bought land out from under grieving widows, who did not even know the land was being sold. She was also going to ask him for a job. She was also, if things went according to the plan she had been building in her mind for 40 miles of hard riding, going to get her land back. She picked up the letter. She folded it carefully. She put it in her breast pocket next to the small leather-bound ledger she had taken from Walter's desk the night before she left Tucson, the ledger that contained numbers she did not yet fully understand, but that she was increasingly certain contained the evidence of something far darker than simple debt. She straightened her back. She took Copper's reins and walked through the gate. The foreman met her before she reached the house. He was a wiry man of about 50 with a sun-battered face and eyes the color of old copper, and he told her his name was Holt and asked her business, and she told him she was Frances Beckett, widow of Walter Beckett, and that she needed to speak with Raymond Bailey on a matter of considerable urgency. Holt looked at the horse. His expression shifted in a way that was interesting, the way a man's face shifts when he recognizes something he was not expecting to see. "That's Walt Beckett's horse," he said. "That's correct," said Frances. "And I am Walt Beckett's widow, and I rode 40 miles this morning, and I would appreciate a glass of water before I have to start arguing with anyone." She had not intended to say that last part, but Holt's expression did something surprising then. He almost smiled. "Come on, then," he said. The ranch house was larger than she had imagined. Not grand, not the way the cattle barons built their houses up in the Northern Territories, but solid and well-made, with a long covered porch running the length of the front face and deep-set windows and a roof that looked like it could withstand actual weather. There were roses climbing a trellis on the south end, which surprised her. She had not expected roses. Raymond Bailey was not on the porch. He was in the yard beside the barn, standing in his shirt sleeves with his arms crossed and his head bent in conversation with 2 of his hands, and when Holt called out to him he turned, and Frances Beckett had her first look at the man who had, deliberately or not, taken everything she owned. He was not what she had imagined. She had imagined someone older, someone with the soft, pampered look of a man who had grown wealthy by acquiring other people's misfortunes. Someone smug and self-satisfied and easy to hate. Raymond Bailey was perhaps 35. He had broad shoulders and a face that had spent its entire life outdoors, honest brown skin darkened by the Arizona sun, dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, and eyes that were a deep, clear gray that she could see even from 20 feet away. He was not handsome in any conventional way, but he was the kind of man you kept looking at, and Frances hated that about him immediately because she did not have time to keep looking at anyone. He walked toward her and his expression was calm and a little wary, the expression of a man who dealt with unexpected visitors often enough to have learned to wait before reacting. "Mrs. Beckett," he said. It was not a question. He had apparently already put together who she was. "Mr. Bailey," she said, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He looked at her steadily. Then he looked at Copper. "That's Walt's horse," he said. "Yes," she said. "He left it to me, along with, or so I believed, 40 acres of land on the eastern edge of your property. Land that apparently you purchased from my husband in December of last year, 4 months before he died, without informing me, his wife, that any such transaction was taking place." Something moved behind Raymond Bailey's eyes. It was not guilt, or not exactly guilt. It was something more complicated than that. "You should come inside," he said. "I intend to," she said. She had not come to this ranch expecting to feel anything except anger. She had not come expecting roses on the porch trellis or a man with complicated gray eyes or the sudden, disorienting sense that she had walked into a story that was larger and stranger than the one she thought she was in. She had come with a plan. She was going to keep the plan. She was going to find out exactly what Walter had done and why, and she was going to find a way to rebuild her life from whatever pieces remained. And she was not going to let Raymond Bailey's unexpectedly honest face, or his unexpectedly solid house, or his unexpectedly gentle way of saying, "You should come inside," distract her from any of that. She followed him up the porch steps. The roses smelled extraordinary. She had left Tucson 3 weeks after the funeral with $7 in her purse, 2 changes of clothes in her saddlebags, and a slowly mounting suspicion that her life with Walter Beckett had been built on ground considerably shakier than she had known. Walter had been a charming man. Everyone agreed on that. Frances herself had been charmed, back in 1872 when she was 20 years old and newly arrived in Arizona Territory from Ohio, and Walter Beckett was the most confident, amusing, seemingly capable man she had ever encountered. He had plans, always plans, and for the first few years of their marriage, some of those plans had actually worked, and they had built a life that was modest but real, and she had been reasonably content. But Walter had a sickness in him that Frances had not understood until too late. Not a physical sickness. A sickness of the soul, maybe, or simply a weakness. A compulsive need to gamble, to speculate, to believe that the next venture would be the one that finally made everything right. And it never was. And slowly, year by year, the life they had built had been mortgaged and sold and wagered away, and Walter had kept smiling and kept promising and kept hiding the worst of it from Frances with the cheerful, devastating competence of a man who had been lying to himself for so long that lying to others felt like second nature. She had known some of it. She had not known all of it. She had not known about the 40 acres. The land had come to Frances from her father's estate in 1879, a small bequest that was meant to give her something of her own, something independent of Walter's schemes. She had thought it was protected. She had never imagined Walter could sell it. She had never imagined he would. The attorney's letter, arriving 3 weeks after the funeral, had been the moment when the floor gave way beneath her entirely. The interior of the Bailey Ranch house was clean and spare, with thick adobe walls that kept the heat out and a flagstone floor in the main room, and a table large enough for 10 people in the kitchen. A woman Frances's age was working at the stove, and she looked up when they came in and Raymond said, "Maria, would you bring some water, please?" And the woman nodded and reached for the pitcher without any fuss. Frances sat down at the kitchen table because Raymond indicated the chair, and she was, despite everything, genuinely tired from the ride and genuinely thirsty. She put her hat on the table and pushed her dark hair back from her face and looked at Raymond Bailey, who sat down across from her with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his ground. "Before you say whatever you have planned to say," he began, My husband sold you 40 acres of land last December, she said. Land that was legally mine, that came to me as an inheritance from my father, not from any shared marital property. I need to know how that happened. Raymond was quiet for a moment. The deed was in both your names, he said. I saw it. I had my attorney examine it. The deed was in both our names, Frances agreed. But there should have been my signature on any sale. I didn't sign anything. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. Raymond reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and removed a folded paper, and he set it on the table and smoothed it flat, and Frances looked at it, and there was her name, and there was a signature in the place where her name was. It was not her handwriting. Frances stared at it for a long moment. She had a very specific relationship with her own signature. She had been practicing a clean, controlled hand since she was 8 years old, and it had never in 40 years looked like what was written on that document. "That is not my signature," she said. Raymond looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the paper again. "I paid $200 for that land," he said slowly. "I imagine you did," said Frances. "And I imagine my husband spent it within a fortnight." She paused. "I'm not saying you're responsible for what he did. I'm saying I want to understand what happened, and I want to know whether any of it can be undone." Maria set 2 tin cups of cool water on the table and withdrew quietly. Frances drank half of hers without stopping. Raymond had not touched his. "Your husband came to me in November," he said. "Said he needed to sell the eastern parcel to clear a debt. I told him I wasn't in the habit of buying land from men in distress at below market value, and he came back in December with all the papers and a price that was fair and a story about how you had both agreed it was the best course. I had no reason to disbelieve him." "No," said Frances, "you wouldn't have had. But if that's a forged signature, it is." Another silence. The kitchen was warm despite the thick walls, and outside Frances could hear the sounds of the ranch operating around them, horses and men, and the distant complaint of cattle. And it was so ordinary and alive that it made the terrible wrongness of what Walter had done feel even more stark. "What is it you're asking me for, Mrs. Beckett?" Raymond said. His voice was careful but not unkind. Frances had rehearsed this part. She had rehearsed it for 40 miles. "I'm asking for work," she said. "I'm asking to earn my keep here while I figure out what options are available to me legally. I'm a good cook and a better bookkeeper, and from what I could see riding in, your accounts office needs help that your foreman isn't qualified to give it. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for wages and a place to sleep and enough time to sort out what my husband actually left behind." Raymond Bailey looked at her for a long time. He had, she thought, a way of looking at things that was completely still, not blank but genuinely quiet, as though he was accustomed to giving his full attention to whatever was in front of him and simply had not gotten around to her yet but intended to. "The horse," he said finally. "Walt didn't leave the horse in the deal. It wasn't mentioned." "No," said Frances. "Copper was his personal horse, left to me in the will. I can show you the documentation." "I wasn't going to challenge it," Raymond said. "I was going to say," he stopped, seemed to reconsider. "That horse has been in my yard for the last 6 weeks." Frances blinked. "I beg your pardon. Walt sent him out here in March. Said he needed to be pastured while Walt sorted some things out in town." Raymond's expression was unreadable. "Walt died in April. Nobody came for the horse. My foreman's been feeding him." Frances sat very still. "March. Walter had sent the horse out here in March, a month before he died, which meant Walter had known in March that something was ending, which meant he had made arrangements, which meant that sending copper to this ranch had been, in some way she did not yet understand, intentional." She reached into her breast pocket. She took out the ledger. "Mr. Bailey," she said, "I think there is considerably more going on here than either of us has understood. And I think we may need each other's help to figure out what it is." She put the ledger on the table between them. Raymond looked at it, then he looked at her. Then he did something she had not expected. He picked up the water cup and drank from it and almost, not quite, but almost smiled. "I'll have Holt show you where you can sleep," he said, And tomorrow morning I'll have my attorney come out." Frances released a breath she had apparently been holding for some time. "Thank you," she said. "Both are welcome," said Raymond Bailey. "You and the horse." She was not sure why that made her throat tighten. It was such a small thing to say. But she had arrived here braced for a fight, armed with legal arguments and righteous anger, and a plan she had built carefully around the assumption that she would be turned away and would have to find another angle. And instead she had been offered water and a place to sleep, and the uncomplicated hospitality of a man who was apparently willing to sit with a complicated situation rather than run from it. She picked up her hat. "I'll need the accounts ledger as well," she said. "If I'm going to help you, I need to see the actual numbers." "In the morning," he said. "Tonight," she said. He looked at her again with that still, full attention look. "Tonight, then," he said. She did not smile. But it was a near thing. Holt showed her to a small, clean room off the back of the main house, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the east pasture, and a washstand with a proper basin and pitcher. It was more than she had been expecting, and she said so, and Holt shrugged and said Mr. Bailey believed in keeping guest rooms ready and that it was no trouble. She unpacked her saddlebags. She washed her face and her hands, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and she was 31 years old, and her face showed it. Showed the last 3 years of a marriage gone wrong and a month of grief and 40 miles of hard riding. And she thought, very deliberately, "I am not finished. I have barely started." She opened the accounts ledger from Bailey's office. He had sent it in with Holt along with a note saying the current year's figures were still being tallied, and she opened Walter's ledger beside it, and she began to read. It took her 2 hours. By the time the lamp had burned down a third of the way, she had found it. Walter had not simply been selling land. Walter had been running a scheme, a long, elaborate, deeply dishonest scheme that involved representing himself as an agent for Raymond Bailey's land company, collecting down payments from homesteaders looking to buy parcels in the Eastern Range, and pocketing the money without ever completing any transactions. The homesteaders thought they were dealing with Bailey's agent. Bailey had no idea anyone was claiming to act on his behalf. And Walter had used the genuine deed to Frances's parcel to establish his credibility, presenting it as evidence that he had authority to conduct sales on Bailey's behalf. The forged signature on the sale to Raymond was not about getting Frances's land. It was about creating a paper trail that made it look like Raymond Bailey had purchased the land legitimately, which in turn made it look like Walter had genuine business dealings with the Bailey Land and Cattle Company, which gave his fraudulent agency claims an appearance of legitimacy. Walter had used Raymond Bailey's name. Walter had used Frances's land. And somewhere out, there were at least 7 homesteading families who had paid money for land they were never going to receive. Frances sat in the lamplight with both ledgers open in front of her and felt something shift in her chest, something cold and clear and final. It was not grief anymore. It was past grief. It was something harder. She went and knocked on Raymond Bailey's study door at 9:30 at night. He opened it in his shirt sleeves, a book in one hand, and he looked at her expression, and whatever he had been about to say evaporated. "Sit down," she said. "I need to show you something." He sat down. She showed him. She watched his face change as he read. Stillness he usually carried cracked at the edges, and underneath it was something very close to fury but controlled, the fury of a man who had learned to keep his anger in his hands and not let it run loose. 7 families, he said. At least 7 that I can identify from these figures. There may be more. These families paid money they likely couldn't afford for land they're never going to get. He set the ledger down. He pressed both hands flat on the desk. "And my name is on all of it." "Your name is on all of it," Frances confirmed. "Which means when those families eventually figure out they've been defrauded, the man they're going to come looking for is you." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Your husband is dead." "Yes. So there's no one to hold accountable except me. Not unless we can establish what actually happened." Frances leaned forward. "Which is why I need your attorney here tomorrow, and why I need access to your full accounts. Because somewhere in your books there should be evidence of exactly what Raymond Bailey's land company has and has not sold, and if we can cross-reference that against Walter's ledger, we can demonstrate that every single one of those transactions was fraudulent and that you had no knowledge of them. And what happens to those families? It was the first question she had not expected him to ask. She had expected him to ask about his own legal exposure, his own reputation, his own financial liability. She had not expected him to ask about the families first. She looked at him. "That's a more complicated question," she said slowly. "Those people paid money in good faith," he said. "They shouldn't lose that money." "You could argue you didn't take it," Frances said. "I could argue it," Raymond said. "But those families still lost it." He said it simply, without drama, and Frances felt something she had not expected to feel in this room, which was a kind of respect that had nothing to do with strategy or planning or what she needed from him. "One thing at a time," she said. "First we have to establish the truth of what happened. Then we figure out what can be done." Raymond nodded. Then he looked up at her. "You rode 40 miles with a ledger full of evidence that implicates your dead husband in a fraud," he said. "You could have burned that ledger. You could have stayed in Tucson and let all of this find its own way to its own conclusion." "I could have," Frances agreed. "Why didn't you?" She considered the question. It deserved a real answer. "Because those families deserve better," she said. "And because my name is in that ledger too, and I will not have my name attached to something rotten for the rest of my life if there is any way to prevent it." She paused. "And because Walter spent 11 years making choices without consulting me, and I am done allowing the consequences of his choices to shape my life without my input." Raymond Bailey looked at her with those gray eyes that were completely steady and completely awake, and Frances Beckett looked back, and it was the first moment, though she would not have admitted it to anyone in the world at that particular instant, that she became aware of him as something other than a problem to be solved. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll send for Caldwell first thing in the morning." She stood. She gathered her papers. She walked to the door. "Mr. Bailey," she said. "Raymond," he said. "If we're going to be working together." She paused at the door. "Raymond, thank you for not throwing me out." He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "Thank you for not letting me walk into a lawsuit without warning me first." She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but she was not afraid, and that was different from the last several weeks, and she noticed it. The attorney, Caldwell, arrived the following afternoon on a dusty black horse, and he was a thin, serious-faced man of about 50, with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and the precise manner of someone who had spent a long time sorting truth from fiction in legal documents. Frances laid everything out on Raymond's office table and walked Caldwell through it methodically, and Raymond sat to the side and asked clarifying questions and let Frances drive the presentation, which she appreciated. Caldwell asked to take the ledgers for 48 hours. He needed to cross-reference them against county records and the territorial land registry. He said the situation was serious but not unresolvable, and that the most important thing was establishing a clear timeline of the fraudulent transactions and Raymond's non-involvement. After he left, Frances went out to the corral and found Copper standing in the shade of the far fence, and she climbed up on the fence rail and sat there in the afternoon heat and let the tension of the day settle. Raymond came and stood at the fence beside her, not climbing up, just leaning with his forearms on the top rail, looking out at the horses. "How long were you married?" he asked. Not intrusively, just as someone who was starting to understand the outlines of a story. 11 years, she said. "We married in 1872 when I was 20. He was 32. Did you know what he was doing before the attorney's letter? I knew he had money troubles. I knew things weren't going well. I didn't know the extent of it." She paused. "I think I was afraid to know the extent of it, which is a thing I'm still working out how to feel about." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Knowing and not knowing aren't always simple when you trust someone. "Did you trust someone once?" she asked. It was a slightly bolder question than she had intended, but something about the way he said it made it feel like there was a personal history behind the words. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My father," he said finally. "He built this ranch, left it to me when he died, which was when I was 22. What he didn't tell me, what I found out over the following 3 years, was that he had borrowed against it heavily and that half the land was technically owed to a bank in Tucson that had been remarkably patient about calling in the debt." He paused. "I spent 7 years paying it off." "Is that what gave you the willingness to buy land cheaply from men in distress?" she asked. "Because you'd been in distress yourself." He looked sideways at her. There was something sharp in his expression but not defensive. "Possibly," he said. "Or possibly it's because I know what it costs to build something and I'm careful about what I take on." He paused. "I'm not a vulture, Mrs. Beckett. I want to be clear about that. Frances," she said, "if we're going to be working together." He almost smiled again. She was beginning to catalog his almost smiles the way you catalog landmarks in unfamiliar territory. "Frances," he said, "I didn't buy your land because your husband was desperate. I bought it because he told me a reasonable story and presented legal documentation, and I had no cause to doubt him. I'm sorry I didn't look more carefully." "You couldn't have known," she said. "Maybe not, but I should have asked more questions." She looked at him. The afternoon light was very direct at this hour, and it lit up the silver threads at his temples and the fine lines around his eyes. And Frances thought that he was a man who had been made by hard work and hard years and had come through both without becoming hard himself, which was not a small thing. "You asked about the families first," she said. "Last night, before you asked about your own legal position. The families are the important part. A lot of men would have disagreed." "A lot of men are wrong about a lot of things," he said simply. Copper ambled over to the fence and pushed his nose against Frances's knee, and she scratched his forelock automatically. "He always liked you?" Raymond asked, nodding at the horse. "He's been mine more than Walter's for the last 3 years," she said. "Walter stopped riding much once things got bad." She paused. "He sent him out here in March, a month before he died. I keep thinking about that." "Maybe he wanted to make sure the horse was somewhere safe," Raymond said. "Or he knew what was coming and he wanted to make sure I had something he hadn't managed to lose." She said it without bitterness. "Or with something past bitterness, something that had been sitting in the sun long enough to have dried out. He wasn't a bad man, he was a weak one. There's a difference and it matters." "It does matter," Raymond said. They stood in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence but the opposite. The kind of quiet that happens between two people who are starting to feel that the space between them is safe enough to stop filling with words. Then Maria called out from the back porch that supper was ready, and they walked back to the house together through the long, warm evening light. And Frances felt, cautiously, like someone who had been braced for catastrophe and found instead something still difficult but not entirely unwelcoming. The days that followed were busy in a way that suited her. Caldwell came back on the third day with a preliminary assessment that confirmed everything Frances had found in the ledger, and added 3 more fraudulent transactions to the total. 10 families had paid Walter Beckett money they believed was going toward legitimate land purchases through the Bailey Land and Cattle Company. The total amount was $430, which in 1883 was enough to represent months of labor for most working families in the territory. Raymond read Caldwell's report at the kitchen table with Frances sitting across from him with her own notes, and when he finished reading he set the paper down and said, "I want to pay them back." Frances looked up from her notes. "The $430, he said. "I want it paid back to those families, all of them." "That's not your legal obligation," Caldwell said carefully. "You can make a strong case that—" "I know it's not my legal obligation," Raymond said. "It's my moral one. My name was on the scheme. These people may never know what actually happened. Even if we establish the fraud, even if the records are corrected, most of them probably won't see a penny because the man who took their money is dead." He paused. $430 is not nothing to me, but it's not everything either. And to those families, it might be the difference between staying on their land and losing it. Caldwell looked at Frances. Frances was already looking at Raymond. "I agree," she said, "but I want to contribute. I have $7 a beat. I'm aware of how that sounds." Raymond almost did the thing she had learned to recognize, almost smiled, and then he did actually smile, fully and without reservation, and it changed his entire face in a way that made Frances want to look at him for considerably longer than was appropriate. $7, he said. "We'll make it work. I also intend to help you identify and locate all 10 families and make sure the payments reach them properly," she said. "I can ride. I know the territory reasonably well, and the documentation should come from both of us, establishing both the fraud and the restitution so there's no confusion later." "That's several weeks of work," Caldwell noted. "Yes," Frances said. "I'm aware." She was aware of something else as well, which was that she had originally intended to stay only long enough to sort out the legal situation and then determine her next steps, and that the original plan was beginning to require some revision because there was more to untangle here than she had initially calculated, and also because, though she was not ready to examine this part too carefully yet, she found herself in no particular hurry to leave. Raymond's ranch operated on a rhythm she fell into more naturally than she would have predicted. She rose before dawn because she had always risen before dawn. She worked in the accounts office in the mornings and rode out with Holt or Raymond in the afternoons to check on grazing ranges or oversee water trough repairs or any of the 100 small operational tasks that a working cattle ranch demanded. She was useful. She had not felt consistently useful in years, and the sensation was so welcome it almost hurt. The hired hands were wary of her at first, as men in that era sometimes were wary of a woman doing work they considered administrative. But she was steady and accurate and fair and unhesitating, and within a week most of them had concluded she was an asset and treated her accordingly. The one exception was a young hand named Decker who made a comment about widows who arrived with their hands out, and Frances told him clearly, and without raising her voice, that she was earning her wages same as anyone, and that if he had a complaint about her work, he was welcome to bring it to Mr. Bailey, and that otherwise she would appreciate being left to do her job. Decker said nothing more. Holt looked at her afterward with what she suspected was approval. She and Raymond fell into the habit of talking after supper. It started practically, reviewing the day's work or discussing the plan for reaching the defrauded families, but it expanded naturally into other territory. She learned that he had come to Arizona from New Mexico, following his father who had followed a land offer that turned out to be more complicated than advertised. She learned that he had a sister in Santa Fe who sent letters he read carefully and answered in a cramped, effortful hand that suggested writing did not come as naturally to him as other things. She learned that he had built most of the east wing of the main house himself, with his own hands, the summer he was 28, and that he was proud of it in the quiet way of a man who does not advertise his pride. He learned things about her too. About Ohio and her parents, and the particular loneliness of being a young woman who was good at mathematics in a time and place that had limited use for women who were good at mathematics. About the early years of her marriage when she had been cautiously, genuinely happy. About the slow erosion of that happiness and her own complicated grief for Walter, which was not simply grief for a man but grief for the self she had been when she believed in him. "Did you love him?" Raymond asked one evening. They were on the porch, which had become their default location for evening conversation, sitting in the 2 wooden chairs at the porch's south end where the rose trellis provided a little natural shade and the smell of the roses came and went on the evening breeze. Frances considered the question honestly. "I loved who I thought he was," she said. "The man I fell in love with was largely a performance, a very good one. He believed in it himself, which is what made it convincing." She paused. "I'm not sure I ever knew the actual Walter Beckett well enough to love him, And that's a strange thing to realize about 11 years of your life. Not strange, Raymond said. Hard. Yes. She looked at the darkening sky. What about you? Have you? She stopped. Have I what? Have you ever been? She stopped again. She was not sure she had the right to ask. No, he said. I was engaged once. She was a woman from Tucson, from a good family. It ended before it went anywhere. What happened? She saw the ranch in summer, he said simply. She decided she didn't want the life that came with it. The heat, Frances said. The isolation mostly, the amount of work, the uncertainty of it. He paused. She wasn't wrong about any of those things. They're real, but they're also what makes it worth having. Frances turned her head and looked at him in the blue evening light. He was looking out at the yard with that quiet, complete attention he gave to everything, and she thought that she had never known a man who seemed so fully at home in his own life, not complacent but genuinely settled, the way a well-built structure is settled into solid ground. The life you built, she said. It shows. He turned to look at her, and whatever he was going to say he seemed to think better of, and what he said instead was, "You're good at this. The accounts, the organizing, the whole of it. Better than anyone I've hired." "Don't change the subject," she said. He looked at her. "I wasn't," he said. "I was getting to it in my own way." The evening deepened around them, and the first stars appeared, and neither of them moved from their chairs. The first of the 10 families lived 12 miles southeast, on a small claim near Wilcox. Frances and Raymond rode out together on a bright June morning, with a written accounting of the fraud and the restitution payment prepared by Caldwell and signed by both of them. The family was named Riordan, a man of about 40, his wife, and 3 children between 6 and 12. They had been waiting for their land transfer for 5 months, and had begun to lose hope, and they did not know yet that the man they had dealt with was dead. Frances let Raymond explain it. She watched his face while he talked to the Riordans, watched the care he took to be clear without being brutal, the way he named the fraud plainly without using it to destroy whatever remained of anyone's dignity. He gave them the payment envelope, and he told them the land claims could still be honored, that Caldwell was working on making the transfers legitimate, that it would take time but it would happen. Mrs. Riordan cried. Mr. Riordan was quiet for a long time and then said, "We thought we'd been fools." "You were dealing with a man who was very practiced at being convincing," Raymond said. "That's not the same thing as being foolish." On the ride back, Frances was quiet for several miles. Raymond rode beside her and did not press her. "You were kind to them," she said finally. "It was the truth," he said. "The truth can be said unkindly." He glanced at her. "Yes, it can. You chose not to. They needed to be able to hold their heads up," he said. "They haven't done anything wrong. Why would I make them feel small?" Frances rode in silence for another mile. "I keep expecting you to be different than you are," she said. "Different how?" "Harder," she said. "Or more territorial, or more focused on what this situation costs you rather than what it costs others." She paused. "You're not what I expected when I came here." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, a fight." He looked at her. "You came ready for one." "I came armed for one," she corrected. "There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. "You had legal arguments and ledgers and a very controlled expression, and I suspect a fairly detailed plan for exactly what you were going to say if I tried to throw you off the property. I did have all of those things. And then I didn't throw you off the property." "And then you didn't throw me off the property," she confirmed. A pause. "Does that bother you?" he asked, not mockingly, genuinely. Frances thought about it. "It confused me," she said. "I'd built an entire framework around the assumption that you would be a problem I had to fight my way through. When you weren't, I had to rethink the whole structure." "And what did the rethought structure look like?" She looked at him. Copper walked easy beneath her, the steady, familiar rhythm of him. The Arizona morning was enormous and blue and clean above them, and the desert smelled of dust and sage and something faintly floral she could not identify. "Like something I hadn't planned for," she said honestly. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and deliberate, the way he was when he was saying something that mattered to him. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right." When Holt told me a woman had ridden in on Walt Beckett's horse and wanted to speak with me, I knew who you were before I walked over. Walter had talked about you." Frances went still. "What did he say?" "He said you were the best person he'd ever known. He said that in the same breath as telling me things about his business that I now understand were complete fabrications, so I didn't know what to make of it. But he said it more than once." "He said," Raymond paused, "he said you deserved a better hand than he dealt you, and that he hoped you'd find one." The desert was very quiet. The horse's hooves made their soft, regular percussion in the dust. Frances looked straight ahead and kept her face still and concentrated on breathing. "He said that," she said. "Yes." "When?" "December, when he came with the deed papers. He was," Raymond chose his word carefully. "He wasn't well, not physically, I don't think. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for too long. And he said those things about you, and it was the only part of anything he said that I believed completely." Frances did not speak for quite a long time. "That might be the kindest and the cruelest thing he ever did," she said finally. "Maybe he knew it was both," Raymond said. She pressed her lips together. She thought about Walter sending the horse out in March, saying those things to Raymond in December, arranging things at the edges in the only way his broken, damaged instincts could manage. She thought about how much she did not know about the last year of his life, and how much she was only now beginning to understand, and she thought about grief, which was not simple and was not clean and did not end on a schedule. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I should have told you sooner." "You told me when it made sense too." They rode the rest of the way back mostly in silence, but it was the kind of silence that had something new and significant settled inside it, like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples still moving. Over the following 3 weeks they visited the remaining 9 families together. Each visit was different. Each family had their own version of hope and disappointment and exhausted relief when the truth was explained and the payment delivered. One family, the Hawthorns, had already given up on the land claim and moved 50 miles north. Caldwell tracked their new address and sent the payment and the accounting by post. One man, a grizzled bachelor homesteader named Prout who had put down $40 for a parcel he wanted to run goats on, refused the restitution payment on the grounds that he didn't need charity from anyone, and Raymond had to spend 45 minutes explaining with considerable patience that it was not charity but return of stolen property, and eventually Prout accepted it with the maximum possible gruffness. On the ride home from Prout's claim, Frances laughed for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, a real, unguarded laugh at Raymond's description of the argument, and Raymond looked at her when she laughed with an expression she only caught for a moment before he looked away, but it was an expression that stayed with her. She had, by this point, thoroughly reorganized his accounts office. The previous system, maintained by a series of seasonal hands with varying competence, had been a palimpsest of different handwriting styles and contradictory filing approaches, and Frances had spent her morning hours building it into something coherent and functional. She had also found 2 instances of overcharging from a supplier in Tombstone and 1 instance of a tenant arrangement that had not been properly documented, and she brought these things to Raymond's attention with the same methodical directness she brought to everything, and he acted on them without argument and paid her wages without fuss, and it was the most professionally satisfying work she had done in years. She was also aware that she was falling in love with him. She did not rush toward the awareness. It arrived in pieces, the way serious things do. It was in the way he talked to his horses, which was unhurried and matter-of-fact and completely without self-consciousness. It was in the way he handled the defrauded families, that unfailing combination of honesty and decency. It was in the evenings on the porch, the slow accumulation of conversations that built a kind of architecture between them, something she recognized as genuine understanding, mutual and real. It was in the way he occasionally knocked on the accounts office door and asked her opinion on something, not as a courtesy, but because he actually wanted to know what she thought. It was also, and she was honest enough with herself to admit this, in his physical presence, which she was increasingly aware of in a way she could not entirely categorize as professional. He was a large man and a quiet one, and he moved with the undemonstrative efficiency of someone who had spent years working hard. And sometimes when he leaned over the desk to look at something she was working on, she was aware of the warmth of him with a specificity that was not remotely appropriate given that she had been a widow for approximately 3 months. She was not sure what to do about any of it. She had not come here for this. She had come with a plan. The plan, at this point, looked substantially different from the one she had arrived with. Caldwell had confirmed that the forged signature voided the sale of her land. In legal terms, the 40 acres reverted to her estate. Raymond, without being asked, had told Caldwell to draw up the corrected deed and offered to cover the legal fees. The land was, at least on paper, hers again, which meant she could leave. The thought arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-July, when the heat was at its most complete and the roses on the trellis were in full second bloom, extravagant and slightly excessive and smelling of something that Frances was beginning to associate with this place in a way that had nothing to do with roses. She was sitting in the account's office with the corrected deed in her hand, and the deed meant she was free, and she had no idea what free looked like from here. She could go back to Tucson. She could sell the land legitimately this time to someone who wanted it for a fair price. She could use that money to build something new, somewhere new. She had skills now that she had not had when she arrived, refined and formalized, and she could find work as a bookkeeper or an accounts manager in a growing territorial town. There were options. There was a future. She had worked very hard to arrive at a point where she had options and a future, and she should be pleased. She was not pleased. She was sitting with a deed in her hand and thinking about Raymond Bailey's almost smiles and his full, real, face-changing smiles and the way he had said you deserve a better hand than he dealt you, and she was not pleased at all. There was a knock at the account's office door. "Come in," she said. Raymond opened the door. He looked at the deed in her hand and his expression did the thing where it went very still. "Caldwell sent it out this morning," Frances said. "I know. He told me yesterday it was ready." He paused. "He said you could come to town any day this week to sign." "I was thinking I'd ride in tomorrow," she said. He nodded, stayed in the doorway, and after that, he said. His voice was steady, but she had been listening to that voice for 2 months and she knew the difference between his ordinary steady and this steady. "I haven't decided," she said. "The accounts work," he said. "It doesn't end when you leave." "I mean," he stopped, restarted. "I mean I could use someone permanently if that was another stop. I'm trying to say something that I don't seem to be saying very well." Frances set the deed on the desk. She stood up. "Raymond," she said. "I don't want you to leave," he said. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he said most things that mattered. "I want to say that clearly, so there's no ambiguity about what I mean. I'm not asking you to stay as an employee. I'm asking—" He stopped again. He ran one hand through his hair, and Frances thought she had never seen him uncertain before, and it was devastating in the most unexpected way. "I'm asking whether there might be something here worth exploring, whether what has been—" He stopped a third time. "Yes," Frances said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. To whatever the end of that sentence was. "Yes." Raymond Bailey crossed the account's office in 3 steps, and Frances Beckett took 2 steps toward him and they met in the middle. And he put both his hands on her face very carefully. "The way you hold something you are not certain yet belongs to you." And she put her hands against his chest where his heartbeat was strong and rapid. And they stood like that for a moment in the July heat with the accounts ledgers stacked around them and the smell of dust and roses coming through the window. "I have only known you for 2 months," he said. "Yes," she said, "I know. My timing is probably—" "Raymond," she said. "Yes." "Stop talking," she said. He kissed her. It was a careful kiss. The way all the important things he did were careful, but it was not tentative. It was entirely certain, the way you are certain about something you have been working toward for a long time, even if you didn't name it while you were working. Frances had not been kissed with any genuine feeling behind it for so long that the experience was briefly overwhelming, and she gripped the front of his shirt and kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. When they stopped, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, something wide open and almost surprised, and she suspected she looked the same way. "All right," he said. His voice was different, warmer. "All right," she laughed. Not the polite, controlled laugh she had learned to use when she needed it, but the real one, the one he had gotten out of her on the ride home from Prout's claim. "I think," she said, "I may need to extend my stay." "I think," he said, "you may need to consider whether it's still a stay." She looked at him. "Is that a question?" "It's moving toward one," he said. "Give me a little time." "You may have as much time as you need," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." She went to Wilcox the next day and signed the corrected deed, and Caldwell walked her through the legal documentation, and she asked the questions she needed to ask and signed where she needed to sign. And on the way back she stopped her horse on the ridge above the Bailey Ranch and looked down at it in the late afternoon light. The ranch was beautiful. Not in the way of something deliberately made beautiful, but in the way of something that had been built with care and sustained with consistent effort, and that showed in every line of its construction. The main house with its long porch, the roses on the trellis, currently burning red and orange in the western sun, the barns and corrals in their practical arrangement, the east pasture where Copper and 3 other horses moved in the easy way of horses who are well kept and unhurried. She had arrived here with nothing but anger and a plan, and she had found something she had not known she was looking for, and she sat on her horse on the ridge and let herself be afraid of it for exactly 1 minute, which she thought was a reasonable amount of time to devote to that particular feeling. Then she rode down. Raymond was waiting on the porch, and he came down the steps when she rode in, and he took Copper's bridle while she dismounted, and when she was on the ground they were standing close together, and he said, "How did it go?" "It went well," she said. "The land is mine again, officially and legally." "Good," he said. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what to do with it." "Yes. It's 40 acres. It's not enough to be a working ranch on its own, but it's contiguous with your eastern range." She looked at him. "I have a proposal." He raised an eyebrow. "I would like to deed it to the Bailey Land and Cattle Company," she said, "in exchange for a permanent position as head of accounts and administration, wages commensurate with the position, and a formal partnership stake in the enterprise." She paused. "And I would like to be very clear that the proposal is purely professional and the other thing is separate, and I am not conflating them." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "The other thing," he said. "Yes. You want to keep them separate." "I think it's important," she said. "I never want to be in a position where I can't distinguish between what I have because I earned it and what I have because of who I love. I spent 11 years in a marriage where the lines were blurred, and I am not doing that again." He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the full, open one, not the careful, almost smile, but the real one. "The professional proposal," he said, "is excellent and I accept it." "Good," she said. "The other thing," he said, "is also excellent." "Good," she said again. "Frances," he said. "Raymond. I am going to court you properly," he said, "because you deserve that, because you have earned things done properly, and I intend to do them that way." She looked at him. There was a warmth in her chest that had been building for weeks and was now, in this moment, almost too much to contain without embarrassing herself. "I would appreciate that," she said. "Good," he said. "Supper is in an hour." He paused. "That's not the start of it, that's just supper." She laughed. She went inside to wash up. The roses on the trellis were very red in the evening light. He courted her properly. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, not in the lavish, overwhelming way of someone who performs emotion. But he was attentive and deliberate and consistent, and those things, she had learned by this point in her life, were considerably more valuable than lavish and overwhelming. He brought her wildflowers because he noticed she paid attention to them on their rides. He asked her opinion on things he cared about: the operation of the ranch, the plan for the upcoming season's cattle drive, a dispute with a neighboring property owner about a shared water source, and he listened to her answers as if they mattered, because to him they did. He remembered things she said casually, details and preferences and old stories about Ohio, and brought them back to her in later conversations in a way that made her feel heard in a way she had not felt heard in a very long time. He also held her hand when they walked in the evenings, which started one night in August when she stumbled on the dark porch step, and he caught her arm and then simply held onto her hand instead of letting go. And neither of them commented on it, and they just walked that way through the warm evening yard. And it was so quiet and so right that she wanted to hold very still so it wouldn't change. In September, 4 months after she had arrived at the ranch gate with Copper and 2 saddlebags, and the righteous fury of a woman with nothing left to lose, Raymond Bailey asked Frances Beckett to marry him. He did it on the eastern ridge at sunset, which she recognized as the place she had stopped on the day she returned from signing the corrected deed, and she suspected he had known that even though she had not told him, because he paid attention to things that way. He was holding his hat in both hands, and he looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and he said, "I know this is still sooner than conventional. I know you have been through things that required you to rebuild from very nearly nothing, and I know that marriage is not a word that carries only good weight for you. I know all of that, and I also know that I love you, Frances Beckett, and that I would like to spend the rest of my life working alongside you and building with you, and that I mean that in every sense, the practical and the personal both, because I think for both of us they belong together." She stood on the eastern ridge in the September evening and looked at the man who had welcomed her and her horse when he had every reason not to, and had cleared the decks of every wrong thing with that same quiet, honest care he brought to everything. And she thought about Walter and about Ohio and about 11 years and about the last 4 months, and she said, "Yes, Raymond, I will marry you." He put the hat back on his head. He kissed her in the enormous Arizona dusk with the whole sky turning amber and rose around them, and she put her arms around him properly, fully, without reservation, and that was that. They were married in October of 1883, on a Saturday morning in the courthouse in Wilcox, with Caldwell as a witness on Raymond's side and a woman named Dorothea Hale, who was Frances's closest friend in the territory, as witness on hers. It was a small ceremony, practical and unpretentious, and afterward they had supper at the best restaurant in Wilcox, and Raymond ordered the champagne they had on the menu, which turned out to be slightly flat but which they drank anyway and were grateful for, and Frances wore the best dress she owned, which she had spent 2 weeks quietly altering to be worthy of the occasion. And Raymond wore his good boots and a jacket she had not seen before, and he looked better than she had the time to tell him during the ceremony itself, which she told him that evening on the ride home under the enormous October stars. "You looked very fine," she said. "I don't think I said that at the time." "You were busy marrying me," he said. "I didn't require additional compliments." "Nevertheless," she said, "you were extraordinary," he said quietly. "In case you were wondering." "I was wondering," she admitted. He reached over in the dark and found her hand, and she let him have it. Copper walked easy behind them on a lead rope because Frances had insisted on riding Copper to her wedding, and Raymond had said of course. The winter that followed was the first season in many years that Frances spent without fear. Not without work. There was an abundance of work, not without difficulty. There were the ordinary difficulties of running a large cattle operation through an Arizona winter with its unpredictable cold snaps and its dry spells and its stubborn, beautiful, demanding landscape. But without the specific, chronic fear of financial collapse, of secrets she didn't know about, of ground giving way beneath her without warning. The accounts were hers now, completely understood, meticulously kept, and she knew exactly where they stood at every moment. Raymond had given her the partnership stake she had asked for, formally documented and legally binding, and she had given him the 40 acres, formally documented and legally binding, and they kept those things clear and separate from the marriage the way she had asked, and it worked. It more than worked. It meant that what they were building together was genuinely joint, genuinely mutual, genuinely belonging to both of them in ways that could be clearly articulated, and there was a particular satisfaction in that which was different from love but lived alongside it very comfortably. She wrote to the Riordan family at Christmas. A brief letter, checking in, asking whether the land transfer had gone through. Mrs. Riordan wrote back in January with a letter that ran to 4 pages, full of news and gratitude, and an account of the children's progress in their schoolwork that Frances read twice. She wrote back. It became a correspondence. She also wrote to Dorothea Hale regularly, and Dorothea came to stay for 2 weeks in February and declared the ranch and Raymond both excellent and Frances suspiciously happy, which Frances took as the highest possible praise. In March, Frances told Raymond she was expecting a child. She told him in the account's office because that was where she happened to be when she was certain enough to say it, and he was there because he had come to discuss the spring cattle drive, and she simply looked up from the ledger and said, "Raymond, I'm pregnant." He went completely still in the way that was distinctive to him, not absence but the opposite total presence, and then he crossed the room and picked her up out of the chair, which she had not expected, and held her with both arms and his face pressed into her hair and said, very quietly, "Frances." "Put me down," she said. "I'm not made of paper." He put her down. He held both her hands. He looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something cracked open and luminous. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm extremely well," she said. "I'm going to be extremely well for the next several months, and then I'm going to need some assistance, and then I'll be extremely well again." "You will have whatever you need," he said. "I know," she said. She did know. That was the thing that was still new enough to be remarkable, the simple, foundational knowledge that she was not alone in this, that she had a partner who meant that word in every sense. She had a son in November of 1884. They named him James William Bailey, James for Raymond's father and William because Frances liked the sound of it. He came into the world with a great deal of objection about the process, and then settled into quiet, focused observation of his surroundings with an intensity that both parents recognized immediately. "He looks like you," Frances told Raymond on the second day. "He looks like a very small and disgruntled person," Raymond said. "It's too early to say." "He has your eyes," Frances said. "He's paying attention to everything." Raymond looked at his son for a long time. "Is that going to be a problem?" "For us," Frances said, "definitely." James turned out to be exactly as he appeared in those first days, quiet, watchful, thorough in everything he undertook, and deeply stubborn about things he had decided were important. He was, in other words, entirely his father's son with his mother's determination, and the combination was simultaneously wonderful and exhausting in approximately equal measure. Copper lived to be 22, which was a good, long life for a horse. He was Frances's horse for every one of those years, and James rode him first, at age 3, with Raymond walking alongside the whole time and Frances watching from the fence with her heart in her throat and her face deliberately calm. Copper was gentle with the boy the way he had always been gentle with Frances, as though he understood the importance of being reliable when it mattered most. The ranch expanded in the years that followed, not spectacularly, not in the way of the big land barons who were already beginning to overreach and find the territory's tolerance for that sort of thing limited, but steadily, carefully, in the way Raymond did everything. Frances's work in the accounts made the difference more than once, identifying opportunities when the numbers genuinely supported them and identifying risks when they didn't. And Raymond's judgment about land and cattle and people provided the operational substance that made the numbers mean something real. They had a second child in 1887, a daughter they named Rose, which Frances chose partly for the obvious reason, and partly because it meant something specific to the particular story of how she had come to this life. Rose was the opposite of James in most ways: loud, social, relentlessly enthusiastic, and interested in everything simultaneously. She had Frances's dark hair and Raymond's gray eyes and the combined personality of two people who had each survived considerable difficulty without losing their essential character, which meant she was going to be formidable. "Two of them," Raymond said one evening, watching James attempt to explain something to Rose, who was listening with her full attention, and then immediately doing the exact opposite of what he'd suggested. "We have two entirely individual people." "That is generally how children work," Frances said. "I know," he sounded satisfied. "I just keep noticing it." She leaned against him on the porch settee he had built the second year of their marriage because she had mentioned once, casually, that she thought a settee would be more comfortable than two chairs for the evenings, and he had built it the following weekend without saying anything, just appeared with it on a Sunday afternoon and placed it at the south end of the porch and said, "I had some wood left over." She had not said anything either. She had sat down on it. He had sat beside her. They had both looked out at the yard. The roses had been in their third autumn bloom. That settee was 9 years old now and still solid, and Frances sat on it on fall evenings and thought about the 40 miles she had ridden with a ledger and a plan and a borrowed kind of courage. And she thought about the woman who had arrived at that gate expecting a fight. And she thought about how that woman had been right to come and right to stay and right about almost everything except the most important part, which was that she had not known, could not have known, that what was waiting for her was not just resolution but something built and true and growing. There was a morning in the autumn of 1889, a Saturday morning in October, the 6th anniversary of their courthouse wedding, when Frances woke before Raymond and lay in the gray pre-dawn light and listened to the ranch waking up around her. The horses in the east pasture, the first birds, the distant sound of Holt, who had been with the ranch for longer now than most things in Frances's life, starting his morning rounds. The adobe walls of the room her husband had built with his own hands, surrounding her with their quiet steadiness. Raymond woke while she was listening, the way he usually did, gradually and completely, and he turned and found her awake and looking at the ceiling. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I was thinking," she said, "that I arrived here with a horse and a plan and a great deal of anger, and none of the plan worked out the way I intended." "No," he agreed. "And yet," she said, he pulled her closer and she settled against his shoulder. "And yet," he said, "I want to do something today," she said. "What?" "Ride out to the eastern parcel," she said. "The 40 acres. I want to take James and Rose, and I want to show them where it starts and where it ends and tell them it was their grandmother's land first and then their mother's land and now it's theirs." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "We'll ride out after breakfast." She turned her head and looked at him in the strengthening morning light. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that had never once looked at her with anything but honesty, not the polished, comfortable honesty that people perform, but the actual kind, the kind that stays with you in the difficult moments because it has always been there in the easy ones. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you too. I have for quite some time. 5 years, longer," he said, "if I'm honest." "You are always honest," she said. "I try to be," he said. "It's the only thing I know how to do consistently well." She laughed, and the morning broadened around them, and James knocked on the door at 10 minutes past 6 to ask about breakfast with the focused urgency of a 6-year-old who had important priorities. And 2-year-old Rose could be heard from her room conducting a vigorous conversation with the rag doll she had named Blue for reasons no one had ever satisfactorily established. They had breakfast together as they did every morning, around the kitchen table that was large enough for 10, with Maria's good coffee and the bread she made on Friday evenings that was always best on Saturday mornings. Frances watched her husband talk to their son about the horses they were going to see, watched James listen with that complete, careful attention that still stopped her heart a little, watched Rose make her devoted way through a piece of bread, while maintaining a running commentary on everything she observed. It was a very full table for a woman who had arrived with 2 saddlebags. After breakfast they saddled up, all 4 of them, James on a steady paint pony named Duke that Raymond had selected with extraordinary care, Rose in front of Raymond on his big black horse because she was still too small for her own mount, and no one was more annoyed about this fact than Rose herself. And Frances on Copper, who was 16 years old and slower than he had been but still smooth and willing and absolutely trustworthy. They rode out through the morning, through the ranch yard and out past the east barn and through the gate into the range, and the Arizona autumn was brilliant around them, clear and high and smelling of the season's particular dry sweetness, the mesquite and the grass and the earth that held the summer's heat and released it slowly into cooler days. The eastern parcel was marked by a line of older fencing and a small stone cairn that Raymond had built in the first year to mark the original boundary. Frances brought Copper to a stop beside the cairn and looked at the land that stretched away from it, her father's bequest, her inheritance, the thing she had ridden 40 miles to recover. "James," she said, "come here." Her son brought the paint pony alongside Copper and looked up at her with Raymond's eyes. "This is where our land starts," she said, "right here where this pile of stones is. Your grandfather, my father, left this to me a long time ago so I would always have something of my own, and now it's part of what we're all building together." She paused. "I want you to know that. I want you to know where things come from." James considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. "Who built the stones?" he asked. "Your father," she said. James looked at Raymond, who had ridden up beside them with Rose, who was currently trying to determine whether she could reach the cairn from Raymond's horse without actually dismounting. "Why?" James asked. "Because your mother's land deserved to have its boundary marked," Raymond said simply, "so everyone would know where it was." James seemed to find this satisfactory. He nodded in the decisive way he had, which was somehow both exactly Frances's habit and also entirely his own. They rode the perimeter of the 40 acres together, the four of them, in the October morning, and Frances felt the land under her in the particular way you feel land you know the history of, that specific combination of weight and meaning that makes a piece of earth more than just earth. She thought about her father, who had been a quiet man with a precise mind and a belief that a woman deserved things of her own. She thought about Walter, who had not understood the value of what he'd taken until it was too late to undo the taking. She thought about 40 miles of desert road and a gate with a painted sign and a man in shirt sleeves who had walked toward her with wary eyes. She thought about how much had happened in this particular corner of the Arizona territory since 1883, and how little of it had gone according to plan, and how entirely right it had all turned out to be. They stopped at the far corner of the parcel, where a stand of cottonwood trees grew around a seasonal spring, leafing out in their autumn gold, the leaves trembling in the light wind. Rose, who had been intermittently restless throughout the ride, suddenly became very still, looking up at the trees with the complete arrested attention of a small child encountering something they recognize as beautiful. "Pretty," she said. "Yes," Frances agreed. "Very pretty." "Ours, ours," Frances said. Rose considered this. Then she leaned back against Raymond's chest with the boneless, total comfort of a child who is completely certain of her safety, and looked up at the gold leaves moving against the blue sky. Raymond's arm tightened around her. He looked at Frances over their daughter's head, and Frances looked back, and it was one of those moments that does not require language because every important thing is already present and already understood. Copper stamped one foot and flicked his ears at something in the cottonwoods, a bird probably, and James said, "Can we have water?" "I'm thirsty," with the perfect timing of a child who has no idea he has just interrupted something his parents will remember for the rest of their lives. Frances laughed. "Yes," she said, "we can have water. We'll stop at the south tank on the way back." She turned Copper and he turned willingly, the way he always had, smooth and reliable in hers, and they rode back toward the ranch through the golden Arizona morning, her family around her, her land beneath her, the whole improbable and magnificent shape of her life spread out in every direction as far as she could see. She had arrived with a horse and a plan. The rancher had said both were welcome. She had not expected to find, alongside the welcome, everything she had stopped allowing herself to believe was still possible. She had not expected honesty offered without agenda, or decency practiced without fanfare, or the specific and irreplaceable comfort of being truly known by someone who had chosen to know you. She had not expected roses, or a porch settee, or a kitchen table large enough for 10, or a man who paid attention to everything including her. She had expected a fight and found a partner instead. She had expected to spend her life in the aftermath of someone else's choices, and found instead that she was free to make her own. She had arrived at a gate with her late husband's horse and her own plans, and the plans had all changed, and the horse was still hers, and what she had instead of the original plans was better than anything she had thought to plan for. That October morning she rode back to the ranch house with her husband and her children, and the cottonwood leaves blew golden behind them, and the roses on the trellis were making their final brave run of the season in red and orange and gold, and Frances Beckett Bailey rode through her own gate in her own land with the sun on her face and the reins of her own horse in her own hands, and thought, with the deep, unguarded certainty of someone who has finally arrived where they belong, yes, this, exactly this. The morning broadened. The ranch received them. The gate closed behind them with its familiar sound, the particular wooden click of a door that knows when it is bringing you home.